that the document be noted, and I call the member for Indi.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. In making my comments today, I'd like to cover off about the importance of closing the gap document. I'll talk a little bit about the history and the importance of the apology. I want to talk about my work here in Parliament during the 6 years that I've been the member for Indi, and I want to talk about what's next. But let me just start with some history. There's a wonderful book called Corroboree or Warpath, The Last Dance of the Wangaratta Pangerang. And in this book, it talks about first contact with white people in my area in 1824 by the great adventurous Hume and Hovell. And it says Hume and Hovell actually followed the Pangerang footsteps. Hume and Hovell didn't make the route themselves. So members of the 1824 exploration expedition travelled along native pathways. There were no other tracks except such as were made by the natives in the neighbourhood of the water. And then a little bit later, it talks about the area around Ovens, the Ovens Valley of northeast Victoria, 1824. The natives hereabout are evidently numerous, as they conclude from their fires, the smoke of which is observed in every direction. And yesterday their voices were distinctly heard, but none of them could be seen. So early white settlement history in northeast Victoria is recorded here. And I have to say, this book is by Wendy Mitchell, who did it as part of her master's degree in regional development. And in my growing up, that's probably the history I got of my area. And it wasn't really until I agreed to stand as a member for Indi that I paid some serious attention to the history and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live in northeast Victoria. And it was the apology that first brought this to my attention. As members will know, Mr Rudd, the Prime Minister, made the apology. But at that time, the federal member for Indi decided that she would not be present for the apology, so she abstained. And the reaction in my community was quite one of horror, because she was our representative and she wasn't there. And I was part of the general movement that said that wasn't good enough. We didn't want a representative who wouldn't represent us. And I have to say that was one of the driving forces that encouraged me to put my hand up. And I made the commitment that when I got elected, I would come to Parliament and I would make the apology on behalf of the people of Indi, which I truly did. But in my preparation for getting elected, I met many of the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I made a policy commitment in 2013 that as a Member of Parliament, if elected, I would form an advisory committee of Aboriginal people to assist in providing advice on issues as health, education and employment. I committed to make a public statement to recognise and acknowledge past mistreatment to stolen generations. And I committed to make an acknowledgement to traditional owners of the land on which I meet at every public assembly. And I'm delighted to say, Deputy Chair, that I've been able to do that. So commitment number one. The second part of me being a Member of Parliament was to be a representative for my community. And I'm delighted and proud to say that I think I've been able to do that. Probably not perfect, but have certainly begun. I've made 11 formal speeches in Parliament around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues in my electorate. I've been speaking on closing the gap, I've asked questions, I've reported on local activities, and I've had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people come to Canberra and we've had deputations. So that's good work. And also as a Member of Parliament, I've been able to go out and reach and network with some of my communities. And I just want to briefly put on record and thank and acknowledge the work of the 3 local Aboriginal networks in my community that provide me with policy advice. To the Gadabar, who are in Mansfield, to the Dirrawara in Wangaratta, and to the Albury-Wodonga Aboriginal Network, and to their leaders. Now, I won't name you all, it's far too many, but I do want to say thank you very much for welcoming me into your community. I want to acknowledge the First Nations Elders Advisory Group that I've met with twice this year and late last year, and thank them particularly for their words of wisdom and the issues that they've presented to me about housing, about health, and about their want to be involved in closing the gap at a regional level. And I want to talk specially about some of the key aunties and uncles that have helped me understand my job better. To Auntie Betty Hood-Cherry, to Uncle Freddie Dowling, to Catherine Corrish, to David Noonan, to Tammy Campbell, to Darren Moffat and to Chris Thorne. Thank you so much for your patience and your tolerance. You've taken me under your wing as your federal member and you've taught me a great deal. And following the learning from knowing you, I was encouraged to put my hand up to be considered for the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition. And that was really, as a Member of Parliament, I think when I absolutely came to understand what it must be, the responsibility I have as a Member of Parliament. So though I thought I'd done reasonable work representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, I know our work hasn't even seriously begun. And I want to just talk briefly to the report of the committee and to just to quote from it. It says that we believe there is a strong desire among all Australians to know more about the history, traditions and culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their contact with other Australians, both good and bad, and a fuller understanding of our history, including the relationship between black and white Australia, will lead to a more reconciled nation. And there are recommendations in the report to do that, particularly around truth-telling. So I want to just talk for a minute about this committee of inquiry, because it came to Albury-Wodonga and we had a number of people, local people, come and present. We had over 24 submissions from Indi to that inquiry. And as I sat and listened to the local people talk about our history of white settlement, efforts around health and education, I came to understand how far we've got to go and how far my community has got to go before we even begin to do some of the serious work of closing the gap. And so I get to the part of my speech where I really want to acknowledge the work of this Constitutional Committee. I want to say thank you to Senator Pat Dodson, when we were in Broome. He took me around and he showed me his community through his eyes. And if ever you have ever been to Broome and you have the opportunity to be guided around by Aboriginal people who give you a sense of their 60,000 years of history, it's something that is just the most wonderful thing to behold. I want to say thank you to Senator Malandindri McCarthy, who came to Beechworth and delivered the Kerford oration to over 400 people at Beechworth, and at the end got a standing ovation for not only her skill of oratory, but her ability to reach across the divide of the Northern Territory and North East Victoria and connect with the community and give us a sense of our shared journey together. I want to say thank you to Linda Burnley, Member of the House of Representatives, and the leadership she's provided in the House, but also our shared work with the women in Torres Strait Islander Women's Leadership Group. And Linda, in acknowledging you, I also want to acknowledge your partner, Rick Farley, who was, when he was with the National Farmers Federation, one day pointed out to me, he said, "Cathy, never ever forget that Australia has a black heart." And I just take that so strongly. And what a wonderful thing it is to think that our culture and our nation is formed, and the heart of us is our Aboriginal traditions. And I also want to thank Julian Lisa, who's the co-chair of that committee, for his wisdom, his knowledge and his professionalism. And I learned so much from watching him at work. And so in bringing my comments to a close on the Closing the Gap and bringing the last speech I will make in Parliament around this topic, I want to commit to do 4 things. I want to talk about our history. I want to talk about being solution-focused. I want to talk about recognition of traditional owners. And I want to talk about the importance of closing the gap, but beginning at the grassroots and not doing top-down work. So let me say about history. When I finish being a Member of Parliament, I commit to understanding and documenting the history of white settlement in my community. Because when we started to look at traditional owners and find out who they were in our community, there's very few of them, and they don't live locally. And the reason why they don't live locally is because they died or they got moved somewhere else. So I live in a really populous part of North East Victoria, and we don't have our local history of that white settlement. And I'm going to work with my community over the next 10 years to document it and begin that process of truth-telling. And I invite the young people here today to be part of this journey with me. As part of your school curriculum, you as young leaders, come with me on the journey to understand our history, our long-time Indigenous history, because I hope, like me, you too will be inspired by it.
The member's time has expired. I thank the member for Indi for her contribution.
Thank you.
The question is that the